Everyone laughed at the old man in the hall, thinking he was a stranger. He sat quietly, not talking to anyone, until his name was read out among the dead. What happened next left the hall in silence, where no one dared to breathe. The morning was gray, like a washed-out jacket. Heavy clouds hung over the city, and only the wet asphalt glistened, as if to remind us that someone still cared. The old man walked slowly, as if measuring each step in advance. His boots were polished, his gait steady, even though his leg dragged behind him. His collar rubbed his neck, but he didn't adjust it. That was the way it had to be. He was in no hurry. He knew that no one was expecting him. Cars were already parked near the officer's house, one expensive, shiny, with a flag, the other with flashing lights. The faces at the entrance were unfamiliar, young, well-fed. They laughed loudly. Someone was smoking under a no-smoking sign. Someone had the edge of a folder sticking out from behind their back. They hadn't had time to hide their certificates. They were going to award each other today. The old man stood in front of the door. He hesitated for a long time before entering. Then he took a step, just as he had once in his youth, across the threshold of the barracks. It was difficult, but there was no turning back. The hall smelled of varnish and cheap coffee. The new linoleum was slippery underfoot. There was a line at the registration desk. Someone argued that his name was definitely on the list. Someone else called someone upstairs. The old man said nothing. He walked past everyone. No badge, no invitation. He sat down at the very end of the third row, quietly, so as not to disturb anyone. His jacket was old but ironed to perfection. 4 medals on the lapel, real ones, not anniversary or commemorative ones. One had been earned in battle. His hands rested on his cane, his fingers were rough, his nails cut short. Not a single unnecessary movement. He looked straight ahead, as if waiting for a command. Behind him, there was giggling. "Look, it's probably one of the security guards," said a young voice. "Or maybe the old man just decided to warm up," smiled a girl. He didn't turn around. Not because he didn't hear. He heard every word. He just didn't see the point. People today don't look. They scan. Anything that doesn't shine is irrelevant. A microphone crackled hoarsely from the speakers. One of the organizers announced, "Dear graduates, please take your seats." And people began to fill the rows. Laughter, clinking glasses, noisy whispers. Men in expensive suits, women in dresses they didn't wear for themselves. They avoided the old man, like old furniture in the corner. They didn't take offense, they just ignored him. He sat motionless, only his eyes, alive, piercing, catching every gesture, every expression on their faces. Like in the old service, you don't trust anyone, but you evaluate everyone. A flag was unfurled on the stage. One of the young officers, apparently the master of ceremonies, nervously checked the microphone. He smelled of cologne and nerves. He glanced around the hall, his gaze lingering on the old man, but quickly looked away. Uncomfortable. It was unclear who he was. Better not to know. And yet, someone couldn't resist. "Grandpa, are you lost?" This is a private event. The man with broad shoulders and a pretentious bald patch said this. A badge with the words Veterans Council in bold letters hung around his neck. The old man raised his head. He didn't look at the man's eyes, but slightly above them, as he had been taught, where the officer's flag should be behind him. "No, I'm not lost," he said quietly, but so that even the 2 at the end of the row fell silent. The man with the badge snorted, as if the old man had personally offended him. But he didn't argue. He just took half a step back, as if from a wall he hadn't expected. "Well, sit there," he muttered, even more quietly. The old man did not respond. He had not come to argue or prove anything. He was simply there. And that was enough to make some people uncomfortable. The orchestra tuned up in the corner, and a saxophone cleared its throat. The first chord of the march rang out across the hall, uncertain, like the steps of a young man. People stood up, some out of habit, some because it was the right thing to do. The old man also rose, slowly, without haste. His cane tapped the floor, like an extra accent, as if someone had forgotten that time was present here. He stood straight, his back like a ramrod, his eyes forward. When the anthem began, he did not sing. He just listened. His lips did not move, only his fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his cane. 2 rows back, someone whispered, "Hey, did you see how many trinkets he has on his chest? It's obviously fake. What a piece of junk." "Yeah, maybe he got fired from the theater, or he ran away from a museum," giggled a girl with a tight bun at the back of her head. The young man in uniform standing next to her, no older than 20, looked at her strangely. Anne fell silent. He looked at the old man, and there was something in his gaze that couldn't be described in words. It seemed like he recognized him. After the anthem, the first speaker took the microphone. A colonel, young, assertive, clearly a career man. He read a rehearsed text about service, honor, and how important it is to remember your roots. No one was really listening. Smartphones glowed. Someone took selfies with the flag in the background. Someone recorded stories. The old man sat motionless. He wasn't waiting for applause. He didn't need approval. But his eyes scanned the rows. He seemed to be searching, not for faces, but for habits, not for names, but for attitudes. He was among people, but not with them. A minute later, the colonel began reading out the names of the guests, honored veterans who had responded to the invitation. Each name was accompanied by applause. People stood up, clapped, nodded. When they got to the name Stanley Clark, the hall fell silent for a second. "Excuse me? I think that's a typo," muttered the colonel and moved on to the next name. No one stood up. No one noticed. No one except Clark himself. The old man bowed his head slightly, as if he understood something. He wasn't offended. He wasn't surprised. He just noted to himself, "They forgot," or crossed out, which, in essence, was the same thing. He didn't move. He didn't object. He didn't ask to speak. He was too old to ask. The smell of coffee and perfume mingled with something foreign. Something rubbery, like in a cloakroom, filled the room. The old man remained in his place when everyone else sat down again. It wasn't because he was tired. He just did everything half a step behind, as if leaving room for those in a hurry. While certificates were being handed out and baskets of flowers presented on stage, one of the young men, completely green, obviously fresh out of school, sat down next to him. He still had an uncertain look, and his uniform was rumpled, not from carelessness, but from excitement. It was obviously an important event. He wanted to make an impression. The young man took out the program. He scanned the list of guests, the names, the years of graduation. He leafed through it quickly, as if looking for something, or someone. Then he glanced at the old man, at the medal on his arm. "Excuse me, what year did you graduate?" he asked quietly. The old man didn't seem to hear him. A few seconds passed before he slowly turned his head. "In 62, he said curtly. It was like he had thrown a piece of stale bread on the table, tasteless but heavy. The young man froze. His pupils narrowed. He buried his face in the brochure again, quickly found the right page, and began to read, as if in a whisper, to himself. 3rd Battalion, Commander of Operations in the Southern Province. Evacuation of civilians under fire. He looked up. His eyes were no longer green. There was something else in them, something that wasn't laughing. "Are you Stanley Clark?" There was no answer, but the old man raised his eyebrows slightly, and that was enough. The guy swallowed hard. He seemed to want to say something, but his mouth was frozen shut. Then he suddenly sat up straight in his chair, as if on command. But no one else saw it. Everyone else continued with their circus. Toasts, applause, noise. Some people clapped only because their neighbor did. All their loyalty to tradition boiled down to a souvenir photo. I, I've heard about you, the young man blurted out. They talked about you in the cadet program. Only, I thought you were already. He didn't finish. The old man didn't answer. He just leaned back slightly, put his hands on the handle of his cane, and closed his eyes. He wasn't asleep. He was just tired of listening to people who didn't know how to be quiet. The young man fell silent. He already knew that he was sitting next to someone who was not just a participant. He was sitting next to a legend. But why did no one remember him? Why had his name been crossed out? Why was he sitting by the aisle like a stranger? He didn't ask. He just sat there silently. And that was enough for the hall to suddenly become a little quieter. Not because everyone heard him, because someone stopped talking. The next speaker appeared on stage. He was fat and red-faced. Judging by his appearance, he was one of those who had risen to his position not through seniority, but through making the right toasts in the right company. He loudly thanked the dear veterans for their service, threw in a couple of phrases about generational continuity, and, barely waiting for polite applause, began to tell a joke about boots and a general. It was as funny as a rotten egg. But the hall laughed. The old man didn't laugh. Neither did the guy next to him. "That's the level we're at," someone behind him muttered. "You have to admit they know how to entertain." "And the old man is still sitting there like a statue," giggled a woman with red lipstick. "Honestly, he's a little scary, like he's dead, only with his eyes open." The old man heard. He heard everything, as usual. But he didn't turn around. He just squeezed the handle of his cane so hard that his knuckles turned white. Something cold and familiar rose inside him. It didn't burn. It dried him out from the inside. That's what happens when betrayal isn't new, but old, just wrapped up in a new package. Photos flashed on the screen behind the stage. Old shots, faces in uniform, group photos in front of a military base. Some people clapped. Others stared at the screen, recognizing themselves at the age of 20. Suddenly, there was a click, a shot from military exercises. The same battalion, the southern province, the heat, helmets knocked off, faces burned by the sun. The commander in the center was young, reserved, stern. The caption read, 3rd Battalion. Ayrete torlayrete arubete mundre. There was silence for 3 seconds. "Who's that stern-looking guy?" asked one of the younger men. "Who knows?" "He looks like our grandfather," someone joked in response. "Come on, ours wouldn't have lived to be that old." The old man sat up straight. He recognized everyone in the photo, including himself. Himself as someone who no longer existed. Only the shell remained. But inside, the memories were still there. The same burden. The presenter did not comment on the photo. He quickly flipped through the frames and showed the faces of the current graduates on the screen again. The audience stirred and came to life. Their attention became superficial again. The lieutenant sitting next to the old man suddenly stood up, silently. No one noticed except him. The guy turned to the hall and slowly said, "Do you know who's sitting in the 3rd row?" The voices stopped. Some turned their heads, some just frowned. What was he getting at? "That's Clark Stanley," said the guy. "The one from the South, from the textbooks, one of those who didn't just serve, one of those who were taught to be respected." Silence. But there was no respect in it, only incomprehension. No one applauded, no one stood up. They stared as if they couldn't believe it. A legend? This guy? In a worn jacket with a cane? The lieutenant sat back down. There was no hint of regret on his face. He had done what he had to do, even if no one understood why. And the old man continued to stare ahead, as if he wasn't surprised, because he had expected it, because he knew that today was no longer about him. By lunchtime, the room had become stuffy. The air conditioners were struggling. The champagne in the glasses was warming up, and faces were glistening. Some people had already started yawning into their fists. Others moved closer to the exit, closer to the buffet. The next speaker took the stage, paper in hand and brow furrowed. "We will now read the names of those who are not with us today," he began, his rehearsed cheerfulness gone. "Those who did not live to see this day, but remain in our ranks forever." The tone changed. The orchestra's drawn-out melody was replaced by a silence as tense as a string. Some people sat up straighter. Some even turned off their phone screens. The old man didn't move. He just stared. Not at the stage, inside himself. There, inside, like in an old warehouse, there were too many names gathering dust. No one read them from the pieces of paper. They lived in his head, in voices, in glances, in their last words. And that was harder than the list on the screen. Captain Andrew Morris, Lieutenant James Rawlins, commander of the 3rd Battalion, the announcer faltered. Lieutenant Colonel Clark Stanley? A strange pause hung in the hall. Someone snorted, out of awkwardness, not mockery. Someone dropped a glass. The sound of glass hitting the floor echoed. Someone whispered, "Wait." But he's here, said the lieutenant, quietly but clearly. Everyone turned around, for the first time during the entire event. At the same time. It was as if the young man's voice had flipped a switch. Dozens of eyes were on the old man. Some looked at him with disbelief. Some looked at him with genuine fear. People suddenly realized that they hadn't just failed to notice him. They had written him off. The host stood rooted to the spot. He was holding a sheet with names, but now he was looking at the hall, at the place where the man who had just been declared dead was sitting. And then, without a word, without a call, one man rose from the front row. A general, old, gray-haired, with a face like a cliff, untouched by time, but weathered by storms. He was covered in medals, his shoulders straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He walked to the edge of the row. He stopped. He looked straight at the old man. For a few seconds, he was silent. And then, slowly, almost ceremoniously, he saluted. "Sir," he said, clearly, without embellishment, just that one word. But it hit the hall like a blank shot, loud, precise, uncompromising. A moment later, a second rose, then a third. Officers, real ones. Those who understood what "sir" meant, and the hall fell silent, because no one else knew what to say. Everyone sat as if nailed to their seats. No shuffling of feet, no coughing, no clinking of glasses, only rare breaths. And then there was that ringing shame that hung in the air like the smell of dust in an old uniform. The old man slowly rose. He did it without drama, as if he had simply stood up to adjust his chair. But his every movement was more precise than the steps of an honor guard. He wasn't acting. He was simply living. And that was enough to make people forget who they were for a moment. He didn't look at the audience. He stared at the stage. The young man was still standing there with the sheet of paper in his hand, blinking rapidly. He clearly didn't know what to do. I'm sorry," he began. "I was told that that is..." The old man didn't listen. He took a step forward, then another. Across the carpet, down the aisle, past the seated people. They moved aside, not abruptly, but as if afraid to get in the way. Some lowered their eyes. Some stared at the floor, as if hoping to sink into it. The cane no longer tapped. He carried it without leaning on it. He walked steadily, along the rows, as if on a parade ground, as if for the last time. He said nothing, but the silence spoke for him. He climbed onto the stage, not up the stairs, from the side, leaning on the railing, slowly, heavily, but on his own. The microphone stood there, breathing in the background. The old man approached it. He stood up, silently, his eyes fixed on the hall. No papers, no prepared speech. Only life, lived, burned out, remaining. "I didn't think I'd come back," he said. His voice was low, as if it were creaking. But in that creak, there was no weakness, only the weight of metal. Not for the awards, and not for the memories. Just, I wanted to see if there was even a drop of memory left here. He looked around the hall. slowly, down the rows, at the faces. He didn't blame anyone, but no one felt innocent. "I didn't know you buried me," he said with a slight smile. "But, it explains a lot." He paused. "Sometimes it's easier to forget than to admit you owe someone, especially if that someone is no longer in power, no stars, no office. Just a man who did his job." His voice didn't tremble. There was no self-pity in a single word, and that made it even more painful to listen to. "But I'm glad I came, if only for one person, the one who still knows what honor means." He nodded toward the lieutenant. The young man sat hunched over, as if ready to sink into the floor from all the attention. The old man did not wait for applause. He simply turned and walked back. The scene seemed to tilt. So weighty was this silent departure. Only when he descended from the podium did someone break down and begin to clap. Slowly, one, then another. Without enthusiasm, but sincerely. Without being told. The audience didn't stand up right away, but they did stand up, and no one asked who the old man was. He returned to his seat as slowly as he had come. Only now the aisle parted not out of politeness, but out of respect. Or perhaps out of guilt. Before, he had been a dusty silhouette lost in the crowd. Now he was a reminder that it was possible to remain silent and betray, without saying a word, simply by not remembering, by simply walking past. He sat down again, carefully. He placed his cane beside him and folded his hands in his lap, and he did not move. The general who had been the first to rise in the hall now approached, without a sound, without fanfare. He stood beside him, not looking him in the eye, as those who feel inferior do, even when they hold a higher rank. "I'm sorry," he said. That was all, quietly. The old man nodded slightly. Not yes, not no, just an acknowledgement that he had heard. "We should have," the general began, but fell silent. He couldn't find the words, or the conscience, and he left, without turning around. He was not a coward, but next to Clark Stanley, anyone felt like a boy. After a couple of minutes, people began to disperse. The ceremony was over. The coffee had grown cold. The room became hot and uncomfortable. Someone approached to shake hands, to thank him, but not out of friendship, out of duty, as if they hoped to wash themselves clean, even if only a little. "My deepest respects, sir," said one. "It's an honor to serve alongside you," echoed another. "To be honest, I didn't know," apologized a third. The old man said nothing. He just listened, not because he wanted to, because there was nothing else left to do, and the only person who remained by his side the entire time was the lieutenant. The young man didn't move a step. He didn't fawn or ask stupid questions. He just stood there, quietly, close by. "May I ask you something?" he finally breathed. The old man nodded. "Why did you come here?" He waited for an answer, a real one. Not the kind they write in the newspapers, not words about tradition or duty. "I wanted to see if you still remembered," said the old man. And that was enough. The old man sat in the hall. People scattered around him like crumbs from a pie. Some hid their eyes, some pretended to be busy, some turned their backs as if in a hurry. The veterans, as they were called from the stage, sorted through the commemorative envelopes and bouquets with ribbons. All that remained was emptiness and the smell of heated jackets. He no longer held his back straight. He sat slightly bent over, his hands on his cane, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Not because he had given up. It was simply because the day was coming to an end. Not according to the clock, but according to how he felt. "Would you like some water?" asked the lieutenant, approaching with a plastic cup. "No, thank you." A silence hung between them, a calm silence. There was no awkwardness, just a pause in which there was no need to say anything more. "I was thinking," the young man began, "maybe you didn't want anyone to recognize you." The old man looked at him, not sternly, Just a glance, as if at someone who had asked too honest a question. "I didn't want to be forgotten," he said. "And then you pretended you remembered." The guy nodded. He understood, right down to the bone, and fell silent again. From the main hall came the hum of voices. Someone had organized a mini banquet. Now there was laughter, the clatter of plates, and some lively music playing. A show to cover up what they didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. "It's a strange thing," said the old man after a pause. "You can be in a photograph in a museum, but no one will recognize you if you walk through the door alive." "That's true. And if you tell them who you are, they'll think you're bragging." The young man smiled slightly, almost guiltily. "And if you don't say anything, they'll forget you." They both fell silent. But now the silence was equal. A woman walked down the corridor in a dress that was too bright, a wine glass in her hand. She saw the old man and looked away. Then, catching herself, she returned. "Excuse me, sir?" She almost whispered it, as if the word burned her tongue. "I wanted to say you spoke very powerfully, and, to be honest, we didn't know much." The old man looked at her for a long time and said nothing. Not, "Thank you," not, "It's too late," just silence. The woman stood there for a moment and then left, slouching slightly. The guy with the cane nodded silently. He was still sitting there, no longer as the younger one, as the one who had decided to remember. The clock in the hall ticked loudly, as if each tick was hitting a nerve. No one paid any attention to it, except the old man. He knew the value of time. He knew that it did not heal, it only took away those who remembered. There was a dent in the sofa next to him. The young man had stood up and walked away to talk to someone at the bar. But it was clear that he had not left. He had not run away like the others. He just gave them space. The old man stretched out his legs and leaned his cane on his stomach. His gaze became distant, almost transparent, not because he was tired. There was simply nothing left to prove. He had come. He had shown up, and that was enough. Another man approached him. He wasn't in uniform. A suit, an expensive tie, a smile that was too bright. "Excuse me, you're Clark Stanley, aren't you?" he said, his voice ringing with ostentatious politeness. "Yes. I just wanted to say that I was very moved by your speech. My grandfather served, and I always—" The old man looked at him, straight to the point, and the man was thrown off balance. His voice trailed off. His face twitched. "Thank you," said the old man evenly. The man stood there for a moment, tugged at the edge of his jacket, and left. Without looking back, the young man returned. He sat down next to him. "Did someone close to you call?" asked the old man unexpectedly. "Number? Why?" "I saw how they turned away." He nodded toward those who had passed by. "In my unit," they said, "if a person turns away, there's no point in approaching them." The young man smiled. "That's a good rule." They fell silent again. "How old are you?" the old man asked. 23. "Then you'll have time. The main thing is not to forget why you put on the uniform." The young man looked at him as if he wanted to promise something, but he held back. He just nodded. Briefly, like a man. A minute later, an administrator approached them, a girl with a badge, too young to understand what had happened. "Excuse me, sir. Are you still here? We need to close up. Only the cleaners are left." The old man stood up, without haste. He bent down and picked up his cane. The lieutenant stood next to him, as if following orders. "Let's go," said the old man. And they left. Two people. One who had already lived his life. The other had his whole life ahead of him. Outside, the sky was already turning gray. The air was damp, as if it had been raining, but there were no drops. It was just cold, like it is after you leave a stuffy room and remember what the air smells like. Real air. The old man stood at the steps. He was in no hurry to go down. He watched the cars driving away one after another. Expensive, dark, identical. each with a driver, each passenger with a tie, a jacket, a past that didn't touch him. He wasn't angry. He just saw and understood. He had understood everything he needed to understand 40 years ago. The lieutenant stood next to him, also silent. He didn't ask if he needed a ride. He just stood there, and that was enough. "You're not one of them," the old man said suddenly, not as a reproach, as a fact. The young man nodded. "Number. I'm from a family of nurses. My mom worked in a hospital at the bases. I grew up surrounded by stories, not from parades, but from hospital beds." The old man smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Those are good roots." They walked toward the road, slowly, not in step, but it just happened that way. The cane tapped uncertainly, but did not beg for mercy. The young man didn't offer his hand, and that was right. Not all gestures are helpful. "Do you have anyone? Family?" "They're still around, someone, somewhere. But I've been on my own for a long time. I understand." They approached the bus stop. The old man sat down on the bench, carefully, as if he didn't want to disturb the metal. The young man remained standing. "Sit down. Why are you standing there? You're not on duty," muttered the old man. The young man sat down next to him, quietly, as if afraid to disturb him. "Sometimes," said the old man, "respect isn't about saying thank you. It's about just sitting there." The young man nodded and said nothing more. A breeze blew through the city bustle, not strong, but precise. The old man closed his eyes. He wasn't asleep. He was just listening to the street. And for the first time that day, he didn't feel like a stranger. They sat at the bus stop as if they had known each other for a long time, although they didn't know each other at all. That's how it is sometimes, when you find yourself next to someone who doesn't ask unnecessary questions. The old man watched the passers-by, young people with headphones, coffee in their hands, in a hurry, lost in their thoughts. He didn't judge them. He just watched. He was invisible to them, like a streetlight that burns during the day. It's there, but it serves no purpose. "When you're silent, people listen to you more," he said suddenly. "And if they don't listen, it means they're talking too loud." The guy didn't immediately understand what he meant, but he didn't ask. He just remembered. He would understand later. The bus pulled up. It was dirty, with rattling doors. The old man didn't get up. He just looked. "Not yours?" "No," he replied. "I'll sit here a while longer." The guy nodded and stayed. Another 5 minutes passed. The wind pulled at their collars. Passers-by hid their hands in their pockets. And they sat there, two people from different times, one with experience, the other with questions. But there was no distance between them anymore, only a pause. "At the academy, they taught us that the most important things were stars, discipline, and subordination," said the young man, staring at the asphalt. "But today, I realize that the most important thing is not to let people forget who they are following." The old man turned slightly. He smiled with the corner of his mouth. Too much pomp, too little truth, and the truth is always quieter. Sometimes you can't hear it at all, but if it's not there, everything else is worth neither a medal nor a flag. The young man paused. "I'm glad you came," he said. "At least someone today spoke honestly." "I didn't come for them," replied the old man. "I came for myself, to make sure there are still people like you left." He stood up, carefully. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from fatigue. "It's time for me to go." The young man stood up too, almost at attention. "Goodbye, sir." The old man looked at him for a long time, and for the first time that day he said the word, "Thank you," and he left. Slowly along the sidewalk, through the evening city, where once again no one recognized him. But now at least one person remembered him. He walked down the street without looking back. No music, no scene. just the sound of footsteps on concrete. His cane no longer tapped. He carried it pressed against his side. Not out of stubbornness. It was just quieter that way. Evening stretched over the city like an old blanket, faded but warm. The streetlights didn't come on right away, and that was right. Not everything has to happen on time. The old man turned the corner. He disappeared from view. No epitaph, no plaque on the wall. Just a bench, still slightly warm from him. Only one person remained standing. In uniform, his face changed in a single day. The young man stared into the darkening alley, as if waiting for the old man to return, although he knew he wouldn't. He wouldn't come back, not because he couldn't, because he couldn't. He sat back down on the same bench, silently, staring at the sidewalk. People passed by. Buses roared. Ordinary life flew by. Only now it was no longer the same. He took out his phone, opened his notes, typed, Clark Stanley, find, read, remember. And then he just deleted it. Everything. Because he realized there was no need to write down what was already inside him. Somewhere deep inside the officer's soul, a mark had been made. Not by his rank, by meaning. A few minutes passed, then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked away. Not after anyone, but forward. With a different look in his eyes, no longer a boy. Already someone who understood that sometimes the strongest person is the one no one notices. If you've read this far, then this story has touched you. Write the word "I remember" in the comments if you believe that respect doesn't need ranks or medals, only truth. It's important for us to know how many of us there are, those who haven't forgotten.